As the adage goes, be careful what you wish for. You just might get it. What is potentially in store for America under a majority conservative Supreme Court? Let's find out right now on the Atheist Forum. Standing by for your questions or comments at 727-441-3000, where you can talk to a real live atheist here on Tan Talk 1340. American conservatives seem perpetually attracted to simple answers to complex issues and the politicians who offer them. Thus, we've been plagued with the administrations of George W. Bush and now President Donald Trump. Are you fed up with American immigrants? Simple. Build a wall and make Mexico pay for it. Want higher paying jobs and better jobs? Simple. Put tariffs on imports and get rid of regulations. How about better schools? Simple. Turn education over to the churches and privatize the entire system. Is morality crumbling in America? Simple. Turn our country into a theocracy. But as these solutions are beginning to be implemented, we're starting to see just how ineffective they are as the simpletons come to realize these issues are far more complex than imagined. So the border wall becomes an absurdly expensive proposition for the American taxpayers when Mexico refuses to pay for it. And as it turns out, the wall will have very little effect on the immigration tide in view of the fact that some 90% of the illegal immigrants already come right through the border crossing points, either hidden in trucks or using work visas, whose holders simply remain in the country when those visas expire. We can see that the tariffs were ill-advised since the taxpayers are now subsidizing unsold farm produce where profitable markets previously existed. Cutting those job-killing regulations results in a more toxic environment for us to live in, with shorter, unhealthier lifespans exchanged for higher corporate profits for the few. And privatizing schools will result in the dumbing down of American students as education standards are eliminated and the lion's share of the education budgets are transferred to the satisfaction of bloated salaries for the corporate CEOs. So, whether it's degeneration of the environment, the education system, or the middle-class standard of living, all geared toward shifting an increasingly higher share of the nation's income into the hands of the top 1%, the single source we have to protect ourselves from these travesties is the courtroom. Which brings us to the reason that the makeup of the United States Supreme Court is so vital to so many of the issues that affect all Americans. So now, our adulterer-in-chief proposes his second nomination to the court, Justice Brett Kavanaugh. If he's seated on the bench, it has the potential to bring about suppression of civil liberties on a scale never imagined by the generation now living in the United States. We are about to find out how right now here on the Atheist Forum. Ed Golly in studio with Jim Peterson and Joe Reinhardt, Tan Talk studio, and our guest from Los Angeles, Edward Tabash. Mr. Tabash is a constitutional lawyer. He's chair of the board of directors of the Center for Inquiry, otherwise known as CFI, and we'll tell you a little bit more about that organization later on the program today. Tabash is recognized for his legal expertise pertaining to the separation of state and church. Eddie also is one of the more well-known atheist debaters in the United States. Mr. Tabash has written amicus briefs urging the separation of state and church in the California Court of Appeal, the California State Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court of the United States of America. Eddie, welcome to the forum. Thank you for taking the time to be with us today. I know this is a passionate topic for you, and you're thoroughly aware of the potential consequences of a majority Supreme Court. Tell us about it.
Well, first of all, thank you for having me. It's very interesting because the very last time I saw all of you in person is when I made a speech in September of 15. I think it was in the Tampa area about the threat of the religious right and what would happen if we had a religious right president winning the 2016 presidential election. Was it there in 2013? What is happening is since 1947, we've never had less than a 5-vote majority on the court to correctly interpret the historical First Amendment and the religion clauses to say government cannot favor believers over non-believers. What this means is we are all equal before the law, and not that the religious are denigrated, but that we non-believers can't be denigrated. It is the most benevolent concept the government could ever put into effect, the equality of everyone before the law, regardless of viewpoint on matters of religion. However, there has been a virulent religious right minority, and one of its intellectual leaders was Justice Antonin Scalia, who believed that government should be able, in his words, to favor religion over irreligion, and who also took the position that the Establishment Clause of the First Amendment permitted, as he said in 2005 dissent, the disregard of the devout atheist and also believers in religions that didn't entail a monotheistic deity. Now, what that would mean is that for the first time ever in American history, a Trump-remade Supreme Court with Gorsuch and Kavanaugh constituting the 2 votes to make a 5-vote majority along with Chief Roberts, Alito, and Thomas, it would mean that government would be free as never before to favor, in Scalia's words, religion over irreligion. The problem with that is it would mean that the value of a member of society in all 50 states and territories could be made dependent upon what our metaphysical views are about how the universe is put together. This would be a very, very backward tragedy. Now, I also want to set this, if I may, in the context of a more universal ideology. The religious right claims to be and are thought to be right-wingers. But it's interesting because what they advocate is the greatest form of government intrusion. In fact, toward the end of his career, the patriarch of all conservatives, Barry Goldwater, turned against the religious right for the very same reason that they violated the principles of limited government. Former governor of New York, Mario Cuomo, said it very well when he said it's rank hypocrisy of the religious right to preach to us about limited government and then to turn around and tell us, the American people, what God to believe in and how to apply the judgment of that God to our bodies and to our bedrooms. And so when Scalia would talk about how a majority of people in a state should be able to criminalize things even that violate their religious beliefs, like same-sex intimacy, he was actually mimicking old-style lefties of power to the people. He didn't. I don't think it was probably lost on him that the kind of intrusive government that he was talking about is contrary to the conservative notion of limited government. We saw the same contradiction 31 years ago when Reagan put up the most dangerous totalitarian thus far nominated to the court, Robert Bork. Bork didn't even believe that the First Amendment protected free speech outside of a political campaign and didn't even believe in a right of privacy. Well, how can you be a conservative Republican advocate for limited government if you don't believe in a right of privacy? So we have an amazing contradiction here. What we see with Kavanaugh, unfortunately, is a clear record of religious privileging. And by that I mean he has the view that the religious, and all they have to do is sincerely hold a belief, and government can't peer into or examine the validity of the belief. But the moment a religious person says, this sincerely violates my religious belief, they should be able to avoid complying with the laws that otherwise bind the rest of us. This is very serious business.
Well, Eddie, would that even apply to somebody like Kim Davis, who wanted to deny the same-sex marriage permits even though she was working for a government agency and it was perfectly legal to issue those permits?
I'm afraid it would in this sense. Now, my argument is once you work for government in your official role as a government employee, it should not. And hopefully even Kavanaugh would agree to that, but there's a wrinkle there. Kavanaugh, along with Gorsuch, Alito, Thomas, and Chief Justice Roberts, now will constitute 5 votes to overturn the 2015 case that gave constitutional protection to same-sex marriage, so that the states will be permitted to once again ban same-sex marriage in the first place.
Eddie, question you mentioned, as long as it's a sincerely held religious belief, do you suppose that the Supreme Court is somehow going to come up with a sincerity test? How do you test?
No, and that's the whole point. It's a good question.
If I say I'm sincere, nobody can say I'm not.
This is what Kavanaugh said.
I mean it.
Yeah. Kavanaugh said all you have to do is to say that you sincerely hold the belief, and that's enough. Let me give you the context of the very frightening case that came out of. The Affordable Care Act gave certain religious institutional employers, then unfortunately extended by the Hobby Lobby case to even private religious employers, the right not to cover insurance for contraception, even though everybody else had to. But all they asked is if you're a religious employer with religious scruples against contraception, you just file one of 2 forms, one with the government or your insurance carrier saying you're not going to cover for contraception, and then the insurance carrier will set about to achieve a private policy with the employee. Well, these spoiled brat priests in this organization, Priests for Life, an anti-choice, anti-contraception organization, didn't even want to fill out that form. And they claimed that notifying the carrier or the government that they won't cover for contraception will trigger a process whereby the employees will ultimately wind up with contraception. Therefore, they're being forced to participate in a process that at the end of the day will result in their employees getting contraception. And Kavanaugh agreed with them.
Eddie, this is Jim Peterson here.
Hi.
Earlier, you referred to Scalia's opinion in which you characterized it as the preference for monotheistic perspective. Since the Constitution, to my knowledge at least, doesn't list a monotheistic perspective as being preferred, how did he arrive at that?
Okay. He,
conclusion?
first of all, he was a highly capable jurist, but he was not as technically formidable in constitutional interpretation as even many progressives think he was. I mean, we were all afraid of him because he was a vote on the court. But in many ways, he contradicted himself. He talked about original intent, and he completely ignored the history. One aspect of it very well stated by Justice Souter in a concurring opinion in Lee versus Weissman, 1992, the case where a majority of the court struck down non-sectarian graduation prayer, public high school graduations. But clearly, we see the framers overtly rejecting proposed wordings of the Constitution of the First Amendment that would have only done no more than just prevent government from favoring one religion over others. We see clearly Madison writing to Jefferson right before drafting the First Amendment that he wanted to protect the equal rights of conscience of infidels. And then we see the final wording, no law even respecting an establishment of religion, let alone establishing religion. And what Scalia did was just by saying, well, we've had a tradition of practice. He once mentioned that, look at how all the presidents pray. Well, you can't say original intent and then look at historical practices. Original intent is what the framers intended, not how people behaved over 200 years after that. So his position was a mass of contradictions. Also, Scalia, at least, in one sense, was very honest. He let us know he had a theocratic agenda. He, for instance, said infamously, interview a few years before he died, that atheists today are being duped by Satan, that rather than possessing people as the devil did in Jesus' time, that the devil now just persuades people that he, the devil, doesn't exist. Scalia also gave a speech once called Fools for Christ, in which he openly defended the concept of believing in religious dogma without evidence. So, but the issue is, first of all, though, there's one area where we think Gorsuch and Kavanaugh will actually be more extreme than Scalia. I was invited back to my alma mater, Loyola Law School of Los Angeles, the Jesuit law school that I went to.
Interesting choice.
And in 1998, where Scalia spoke, and I got to go up to him afterwards and to ask him questions, very polite. And he said to me things like, if a state wants to allow abortion or allow assisted suicide, I'll let them. If they want to ban it, I'll let them. I believe it's up to the state, not to the individual. Well, at least in the question of death with dignity and assistance in dying, Gorsuch wrote a book a number of years ago where he said that the states can't even allow it if they want to because of the 14th Amendment protection of innocent life. So Gorsuch would be more extreme than Scalia. And the Priest for Life case is very instructive, because what Kavanaugh said was that even filing a notice saying, I'm not going to provide contraception, so that the employee and the government, the carrier, could work it out on their own, if Kavanaugh said that you have, as a religious person, a right to be exempt from even that minimal act if it violates your religious scruples, that's very extreme. Also, there's something, this is a bit ironic, it's actually funny. I don't know if the overwhelming majority of evangelical Protestants who support Kavanaugh are aware of this case. It was a 2-1 decision where Kavanaugh wrote the majority opinion, where a group of Protestant Navy chaplains, general organization, sued the Navy because the Navy was providing greater retirement benefits to Catholic chaplains than to Protestant chaplains. And Kavanaugh said, even if this were true, these plaintiffs don't have standing because they're not specifically naval Protestant chaplains. And a dissenting opinion by Judge Rogers on the D.C. Court of Appeal said that if you are a member of a religious belief system discriminated against by a branch of government, that should give you standing. But notice how Kavanaugh cleverly was able to craft an opinion that in the final analysis let the Navy, a branch of the U.S. military, continue to preferentially discriminate in favor of his fellow Catholics versus Protestants.
Ed, I'm sure you've heard this thousands of times because it's become a pretty well-known cliche, but we all understand that an activist judge is one who delivers a verdict that you don't agree with. That's how we can tell them apart.
Right. Yeah, and so this is very interesting. However, one of the problems is the speech that Kavanaugh gave just last year, where he actually extolled former Chief Justice William Rehnquist for his retrenchment from church-state separation. Kavanaugh specifically mentioned in the speech how right Rehnquist was to reject the metaphor of a wall of separation. And he actually praised Rehnquist for setting in motion a pulling away from church-state separation that led to the Town of Greece versus Galloway case, where the court allowed sectarian prayers at town council meetings. So we see here that Kavanaugh is an overt enemy of the benevolent concept of equality before the law for everyone. Another very bad example was in a case to stop official prayers at presidential inaugurations. Kavanaugh said that to not have prayers would be to show hostility toward religion and establish atheism. Well, that's like our saying to not mention a godless universe is to establish religion and show hostility to atheism. What he's saying is if you're neutral, if you treat everyone as equal, then you are being hostile to religion. He's saying the only way to not be hostile to religion is to single out religion for special privileges that no one else gets.
This guy sounds like a Mike Pence appointment to me, just in the same way he came up with DeVos. Trump doesn't know who judges are. It's got the stench of Mike Pence, or as we call him, Mike Dents, all over it, doesn't it, Joe?
Yes, and they all rhyme.
Yeah.
I see the hand of Providence here, Ed.
Yeah, of course. One of the things that is essential now, and I'd like to address, though it's a very narrow window and the odds are against us, I'd like to discuss, even though they're a bit dim, some of the prospects of trying to defeat the nomination.
I was about to ask you if you wanted to
that's okay.
bet
First
on the
of all,
likelihood that he would be confirmed.
Anybody that any of us know who live in Maine or Alaska, if they live in Maine, they need to contact Senator Susan Collins, who wavers. She does eventually vote for Trump's judicial nominees, but she and Republican Senator Murkowski of Alaska are the two moderate Republicans who do dangle the possibility of voting no if they can be persuaded the candidate is truly anti-choice on abortion. So I'd really urge that anybody who knows anybody in these two states should have the people in those states contact their respective senators. Now, in order to defeat this nomination, all the 49 Democrats would have to hold the line, and 2 Republicans would have to be picked up. If it's a 50-50 tie, Pence breaks the tie. In the Gorsuch confirmation last year, 3 Democrats defected because of the very religious right-wing states they are in. And one was Donnelly of Indiana, Heitkamp of North Dakota, and Manchin of West Virginia. If anybody knows anybody in those 3 states, it would be really essential for them to have them contact those senators and urge them to vote against Kavanaugh. It's also very important right now for those of you in Florida, because Senator Nelson is facing the governor's challenge to the Senate seat, to contact Senator Nelson and let him see that there is substantial support to back him up in his opposition to Kavanaugh. That would be because he's going to be under enormous pressure to vote to confirm, and he really needs to hear that there is tremendous support from voters in the state of Florida for him to hold the line.
Okay, if you've just joined us, you're listening to the Atheist Forum on the Tan Talk Radio Network, and our guest from Los Angeles is Eddie Tabash, a constitutional lawyer. He's also chair of the board of directors of the Center for Inquiry, which is also known as CFI. We're going to take a short pause, tell you a little bit about Atheists of Florida. When we return, we'll let Mr. Tabash tell you about the Center for Inquiry here on the Tan Talk Radio Network. Atheists of Florida is a nonprofit membership organization founded in 1992. For over 25 years, Atheists of Florida has brought atheists together to address state-church separation issues, provide legal assistance in cases of religious discrimination in employment or educational institutions, help atheists meet others who want to live their lives free of religion, and produce the Atheist Forum. For membership information, visit our website at atheistofflorida.com, where you'll find our newsletters, annual reports, statement of purpose, and information about meetings and events. That's atheistofflorida.com. 441-3000 if you'd like to join the conversation here on the Tan Talk Radio Network. Ed Golly with Jim Peterson and Joe Reinhardt, who has our quote for the day. Joe?
Thank you, Ed. Our quote for today is from George W. Bush. That would be George Light Bush II, as you may recall. This was delivered in Beaverton, Oregon on September 25th in the year of 2000. George W. Bush. It is clear our nation is reliant upon big foreign oil. More and more of our imports come from overseas.
A brilliant mind to guide our country into the 21st century, and we saw the results. Eddie, tell us a little about the Center for Inquiry, what their aims and purposes are, and why some of our listeners might be interested in finding out more.
Okay, first of all, anybody interested can go to centerforinquiry.org, centerforinquiry.org. Center for Inquiry was founded by secular humanist philosopher Paul Kurtz, and it has a dual purpose. One is atheistic secular humanism, which embraces church-state separation, and the other is scientific skepticism. And they're actually two sides of the same coin. Reason and evidence are seamless in the way they are applied to the natural world. And so the claims against ESP and UFOs are in the same line as the claims against life after death, resurrected souls, disembodied gods, miracles. They are all rejections of the paranormal and the supernatural unless and until there would be sufficient evidence to believe that. Now, what we're trying to do, we've also merged with the Richard Dawkins Foundation for Reason and Science. We're trying to establish a nationwide and worldwide environment where science and reason displace all dogmas. And it's funny because we the joke is, if somebody ever tries to kill me, we'd be hard pressed to determine if it was a religious fundamentalist or an advocate of alternative medicine. And basically, as Tom Flynn, the editor of Free Inquiry, jokingly puts it, we're also the skunks at the garden party. Anytime someone has a belief in the fantastic, the paranormal, the supernatural, we come along with our pin of evidence and pop the balloon. But right now, we are focused on, of course, preserving the secular state, the modern secular state, and that requires preserving the courts. We also, again, merging both aspects of secular humanism, scientific skepticism, are heavily involved in the fight against intelligent design and creationism. And so we basically we don't get into political issues unrelated to science and secularism, but within the purview of what we do in our church-state separation work, we do include LGBTQ rights and reproductive freedoms. So whenever there is a struggle for liberty on which the religious right is on the other side, that's included within the framework of our issues.
Now, by secular state, you mean the one that was founded by Thomas Jefferson, George Washington, Benjamin Franklin, and so forth?
Yeah, I'm talking about the
one we all love so much.
Yeah, the one that we stand to lose with Kavanaugh's confirmation to the court. But you see, right now, just like the Supreme Court is a numbers game, the magic number for a majority is 5. In defeating his nomination, unfortunately, the magic number is 51, and that is it's extremely important that people in iffy states where there is a strong religious right-wing presence, that they contact the senators who they know want to vote against this nomination and give them the courage and support to do so.
Eddie,
the odds don't look that good right now, but we have to try.
Eddie, what happens when we defeat Kavanaugh's nomination? He turns out to be a stalking horse, and the guy that replaces him makes him look like
Thurgood Marshall.
Yeah,
Yeah,
looks like we missed a great opportunity.
We take the risk because look at what happened. We, in 87, we defeated the right-wing extremist, the totalitarian Robert Bork, and we got a very thoughtful, moderate conservative who, though we lost him in many ways on some of the edges and boundaries of our issue, kept the core principle of church-state separation. Now, when I say that, there was a world of difference between the Anthony Kennedy that Reagan had to settle on and the Robert Bork that he originally wanted. And there's a world of difference between the Kennedy we just lost and the Kavanaugh who would replace him. Every single LGBTQ rights case of the past more than 20 years, the 3 most major cases were authored by Kennedy in the majority opinion, including the 2015 same-sex marriage case.
You know, I can't think of any example where we've had any great advancement in civil liberties or in our social situations that came from the legislature rather than the courts. The courts, as far as my memory goes, are 100% responsible for the fact that we have advanced as a society.
Exactly. We wouldn't, for instance, we would have never gotten school desegregation in 1954 if it weren't for a Supreme Court that didn't have to face the voters.
We still don't have it. That's the proof of that.
Yeah, that we at least a decision on its behalf, and so only an unelected court that doesn't have to face removal from office by a popular uprising can say no to the majority. In 1962 and 63, when the court struck down official prayer and Bible reading in the public schools, there was a horrendous outcry. And the members of the majority of the court who voted in favor of those decisions would have been removed by the voters if they could have been.
That came down 8-1, didn't it?
Yeah, and then remember, just a few years ago, all the members of the Iowa Supreme Court who voted for same-sex marriage were removed by the voters. So a judiciary that's insulated from popular reprisal is essential to expanding and preserving our liberties. And that becomes really crucial when we're dealing particularly in a nation and in many, if not most states, where the people want government to put its power behind religion.
Questions, comments, or insults for Eddie Tabash? 441-3000. We have a caller right now. Let's check in. How can we help you?
Yeah, this is my question. My name is Bill Seeker. My doctorate is in health psychology. I do believe things can be turned around. Notice the global warming or situation. Well, American people are now recognized that it's true. The denial is going, the self-delusion is going. And the reason for that is because people are dying all over the world, including the United States. Now, this is what I would like your opinion on this. My feeling is that to educate people, you have to educate them where they live, how things directly affect them. For example, the fundamentalist Southern evangelical Protestants deny evolution, they deny science, and it goes on and on. However, in the United States, what we're seeing is contaminated water, the rise in cancer rates, the rise in asthma, all kinds of things are happening. The schools, lead in the schools. In my opinion, what is occurring in the United States in regards to health issues, for example, in Florida alone, 8 counties have toxic algae blooms. They've got it in Lake Erie. It goes on and on and on.
What are your thoughts on this, Ed?
Okay, well, caller raises an exceptionally important issue, and that is that climate change, particularly the past few days here in Los Angeles, where we're having Florida-style humidity to such a degree, I almost called Ed Golly and said, "Hey, you want to pick me up for lunch?" And I realized I was still in California.
But you're on fire out there, too, right?
Anti-science is going to be a strong factor. But for our immediate purposes of preventing the 5th religious right-wing vote on the court, it's not going to happen soon enough. Kavanaugh could be confirmed within less than 2 months. And so while the caller is absolutely correct that long-term we might be able to harness the reality of the dangers of climate change to show that the religious right-wing anti-science agenda is wrong, that's not going to happen immediately enough to stop this nomination. And that's what we're dealing with now.
Suppose Trump is gone in 2 months.
First of all, quite frankly, for those of us who care about secular government, at this moment in time, we need him to stay exactly where he is. Any departure of Trump from the presidency would put the 46th president of the United States would be the most sincere, true-believing religious fundamentalist we have ever seen.
Right, and the minute there's some sort of economic or military disaster, he declares martial law, and now he's not the president, he's the god of the U.S. Oh,
well,
boy.
Yeah, but I would actually, at this point, I would take my chances with a President Trump as opposed to a President Pence.
But Eddie, Kavanaugh has clarified that he believes a sitting president should not be prosecuted for anything while he's in
Right,
office.
yes,
That
right.
essentially makes him
Well, I mean, certainly,
immune.
you see, now our immediate task is to try to stop this nomination. What we're speaking about, let's say there's a change even in Senate leadership come this fall. That's not going to happen in time to stop this nomination.
Yeah, right.
And so, again, as realists, there is a greater likelihood in the confirmation of Kavanaugh to the Supreme Court than in his defeat, but we still have to try. But none of the political controversies, even the newly released tape of attorney Michael Cohen and Trump discussing what to do about the woman he met at the Playboy Mansion, none of that is going to play out. Even the Russian situation is not going to work itself out to a conclusion prior to the vote to confirm Kavanaugh.
hate the sin, elect the sinner, right?
Yeah, and yeah, exactly.
All too often.
So our immediate goal.
You love the fetus.
Yeah.
hate the
Now,
child, etc.
another thing that would be interesting. Is, of course, I mean, Senator Nelson needs all the backup and support he can get from people living in Florida to back him up in what will be a no vote on Kavanaugh, and he's taking a tremendous risk. He's taking a tremendous risk in voting against Kavanaugh because he's running for re-election against the governor. So this is something where he needs to hear from as many people in the state as possible that yes, we want you to vote against Kavanaugh. And while you're at it, even though it seems like a throwaway, what if all of a sudden, I don't know how many communications could be generated. Let's say Marco Rubio got 1,000 communications to his office from people in Florida saying, by the way, vote against Kavanaugh. I don't know what impact it would have, but it would be interesting. I mean, there's no reason not to try. But
yeah, I agree with that. I think that's a good idea. As long as they're very specific and they say facts. This is how it's going to affect me, my family, my kids. It can't be, like some airy-fairy nonsense where he's a bad guy, but how specifically the election, I mean, the confirmation of Kavanaugh affects you personally, then it works. It doesn't work with the name calling.
No, absolutely not. But
that's a great idea.
Now, the one thing that we all have to be ready for if Kavanaugh is confirmed, I mean, the caller made a good point about global warming, but its devastation to turning things around will not come about in time for defeating this nominee to the Supreme Court this year.
Yeah.
But the first thing, if Kavanaugh is confirmed, the first major destructive blow we're going to feel, but then it'll be too late because he'll be one of the 5-vote majority, is when the Supreme Court overturns Roe versus Wade and an overwhelming majority of the states ban abortion, and it looks like Florida would be one of them right now. That will be the outcry, even before global warming comes to its full pitch.
Yeah, thanks, caller. Thanks for checking in with us.
Thank you.
Eddie, how do you think Kavanaugh would rule on the very existence of Planned Parenthood, and could he get 4 other votes from the court to support the elimination of it? I imagine it could be done away with by executive order supported by the court.
I don't think it would be an issue of the courts. I mean, it couldn't be done away with because it's a private entity. What would happen would be the defunding. And here's the thing: the government would be able to defund Planned Parenthood and would have to subsist on purely private donations. The precedent was set in 1991 in the case of Rust versus Sullivan, where the court said that the government is free to withhold money from any clinic that even mentions or talks about abortion, let alone performs them. So I think that even now, the current court would allow the Congress of the United States to no longer provide any funding for Planned Parenthood. I don't think anybody could force the organization to go out of business if it were subsisting on private contributions.
But that was one of the promises of Trump, right? To get rid of it because it's sort of the flagship institution.
Right. No, his promise was to make it ineffective by removing public money, taxpayer dollars. But he never could have. You can't shut down a private corporation. What you can do is, if it can survive on public money, it will. But you can't. You can't close it down. But you can maybe withhold government-provided financial support.
You could regulate it out of existence.
That's what I'm thinking. Exactly. Can't you regulate it out of business?
But again, under Rust versus Sullivan, that precedent already exists. You see, where Kavanaugh can make a world of difference is every time that the court was on the verge of overturning Roe, Kennedy was the swing vote to keep it, particularly beginning with Planned Parenthood versus Casey in 1992.
But didn't Kavanaugh say that it's established law now? Hasn't he implied that he wouldn't challenge it?
Well, when he says it's established law, see, what he's saying by saying it's established law, and I think he is that it's currently the law. I mean, given the views he's expressed so far, it would be remarkable if he voted to keep it. But certainly, it's to his advantage. It's to his advantage to take all the spotlight off of abortion right now. And by saying it's established law, he's making a sort of truism. He's saying, yes, it's established law. You can't argue with it. Even if you disagree with it, it's established law.
Right.
Even if you are planning to vote to overturn it, it's established law.
Right.
So in many ways, it's unassailable. It's established law. That tells us nothing what he will do if he has the power to make it no longer established law.
Does he have a lot of public statements that make it seem as if he can't tell the difference between a podium and a pulpit?
The worst one was the speech last year where he lauded Chief Justice Rehnquist's work in eroding the wall of separation between religion and government. That was the worst. Because, in addition to his judicial opinions, there was no case or controversy before him as a Court of Appeals judge that he had to rule on and write an opinion about. This was a speech he voluntarily gave. And
unprovoked assault.
The quotes from Kavanaugh, very interesting. The quotes from Kavanaugh where he lauded Rehnquist were in Rehnquist's dissent in striking down the Alabama Moment of Silence statute in 1985. And in that dissent, Rehnquist even favorably quoted 19th century Supreme Court Justice Joseph Story to the effect that our government should openly promote Christianity.
Well, Eddie, we're down to about 2.5 minutes. I know you're missing the Price is Right for this, but I do have one question for you that you can probably wrap up quickly. Beyond the imminent threats to those of us who live our lives free of religion, what do you perceive as the most significant threat to American liberties under a majority conservative Supreme Court?
That would be it. That would be it. For a religious right-wing dominated Supreme Court to say government no longer has to be benevolently neutral between believers and non-believers. The moment government could show favoritism for those who believe in a supernatural being as against those of us who don't, that is the foundation of religious tyranny.
So it opens the floodgates to all kinds of federal funding for religion, religious schools, rebuilding.
State funding, too.
Yeah. Exactly. In other words, the church
belly
can
up
belly
to the trough.
It means we all have to be Presbyterians now.
Well, if you've joined us partway through the program, you've been listening to our guest from Los Angeles, California, Eddie Tabash, who is the chair of directors for Center for Inquiry, which has its executive offices in Washington, D.C., and the headquarters are in Amherst, New York. Eddie, you want to just again mention how our listeners can reach your organization?
Yes. All you have to do is go to centerforinquiry.org and find out all about the organization. And again, I really appreciate that you had me on the program. Florida is a very, very crucial battleground state and has always been in the fight to defeat the religious right.
Well, I hope it's not the last time we have you on, because I know there are going to be a lot of issues pertaining to state-church separation and as we continue through the nightmare of the Trump administration. So I hope we can have you again. You've given us an awful lot of insight, questions I couldn't even get to today that I'd love to hear your opinion on. So,
and for those of you who would like to review today's program, go to our archives at aof.ngo. And you can listen all over again, because this is really packed full of good stuff.
And, of course, you have an extensive diatribe about Kavanaugh, this nomination, on the CFI website. Isn't that right, Eddie?
Yes.
Okay,
yeah,
great.
Where I analyzed specifically his cases and that speech he gave last year where he showed total support for Rehnquist's erosion.
Thanks, Eddie. Hope you'll join us again next week on the Atheist Forum.
Thanks again for having me. Thank you.
You have been listening to the Atheist Forum. To learn more about Atheists of Florida, visit our website at atheistofflorida.com. Continue the discussion on our website, talk.aof.ngo. Join us again next Sunday for another edition of the Atheist Forum here on Tan Talk 1340.